1876. His History of America's Founding Year is in its 28th week on the bestseller list. Al Franken is in the 9th slot with his critique of the Bush administration, The Truth with Jokes. James Fry rounds out the top 10. My Friend Leonard details his friendship with a mobster. For more information, visit the New York Times website at nytimes.com and click on Books.
In Pornified, Pamela Paul argues that women are being urged to embrace pornography in today's culture. She's one of several authors at this panel about the current state of sexuality in America, hosted by New School University in New York City. Portions of this hour 40-minute program contain language that some may find offensive.
You all have the bios for tonight's speakers, so I'm not going to go too into depth, but I do want to introduce them all briefly. We're thrilled that they could be here with us tonight. It's a very accomplished, talented panel. We're thrilled that they took the time to come here tonight and talk about this very interesting and provocative topic. Starting on my left, rest on my left, Pamela Paul is the author of both Pornified, How the Culture of Pornography is Transforming Our Lives, Our Relationships, and Our Families, and The Starter Marriage and the Future of Matrimony. A journalist, Pamela is a contributor to Time magazine and has written for numerous publications, including The Economist, the New York Times Book Review, and Psychology Today. She speaks frequently on TV and radio about issues related to marriage and divorce, social and demographic trends, and generational issues. Nadine Strassen. Nadine is a law professor at New York Law School and since 1991 has been the first woman to serve as president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Named by numerous magazines over the years as one of the most influential women in America, Nadine writes extensively and spends much of her time traveling and speaking to groups in the U.S. and abroad, as well as appearing on TV news shows and talk radio. She's the author of Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights. Nelson George is a writer and cultural critic and has written numerous fiction and nonfiction books, including Hip Hop America, Night Work, and he was co-writer of Russell Simmons' autobiography, Life and Death. His story, It's Never Too Late in New York, appeared in Susie Bright's collection of Best American Erotica 2005. And also a filmmaker, Nelson was an investor in Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It and has several films of his own, including To Be a Black Man with Samuel Jackson and a documentary, A Great Day in Hip Hop. Ariel Levy. Ariel is a writer for New York Magazine, and her work has also appeared in Vogue, Slate, Men's Journal, and Blender magazines. She's the author of the recently released book, Female Chauvinist Pigs, Women and the Rise of Raunch Culture. Kay Heimowitz is the William E. Simon Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of the City Journal. She's a principal contributor to Modern Sex, Liberation, and Its Discontents, and is author of Liberation's Children, Parents and Kids in a Postmodern Age. Kay has written for many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And Katie Ornstein is an award-winning author, journalist, and cultural critic who writes on women's politics, popular culture, mythology, human rights, and Haiti. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Ms. Magazine, among other places, and she's the author of Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, Sex, Morality, and the Evolution of a Fairy Tale. And Katie's moderated several conversations with us, so I'm going to turn the conversation over to her.
Okay, thank you. Is this working? Can everyone hear me? I don't sound as loud as I thought I would. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Rebecca and the Center for Communications. This is, I've had a number of opportunities to work with Rebecca and Catherine, and a lot of you probably know about the Center for Communications. If you don't, though, and if you've come for other reasons, I would say check out their website. It's a great organization, and these panels have always been fantastic. So thanks to them. And also thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to all of you for coming. I really apologize for the people who are sitting behind me, and I think because it's being filmed, I'm not sure if I can turn my chair. Can I? Does anyone know? So I can't. I apologize. So it's a huge audience. I hope none of you thought we were actually going to be showing porn tonight. If anyone wants to leave now, because we won't be. So we're bringing together a panel of social critics and activists and civil libertarians and producers of culture to discuss the meaning and consequences of porn, to not actually show porn. And while I was preparing for this panel, I went and looked back at some of the other panels on pornography and related themes that have taken place over the years. And 20 years ago, or roughly, in 1984, Harper's Magazine hosted a panel on this very topic in this, as fate would have it, in this actual same spot. And It was 1984, and only a few short months before the panel, Vanessa Williams, the reigning Miss America, found herself displayed on the pages of Penthouse magazine. And looking back at the press coverage of that, I was sort of amazed to see how scandalous it was, because today, appearing in a porn video is the sort of thing that actually made Paris Hilton a celebrity. And still, even then, the moderator of that panel, it was Mark Danner, amidst all the public outrage at Penthouse for exploiting Vanessa Williams, at Vanessa Williams for being so naive, and at the pageant committee for forcing her to give up her crown, it's worth noting that that issue of Penthouse was actually the greatest selling, the best-selling issue that they had ever done. 6 million people bought the issue. And so in 1984, there was still a lot of porn, but somehow it was a little bit more taboo. And so today, we're going to talk about the ways that pornography has evolved and become such a part of our culture, a pornified culture, as Pamela calls it in her book, and what that means. And the questions that I'm going to ask are really grouped into 3 sets. First, what is the nature of pornography today? What is pornography? If pornography is part of everyday life, what really is porn and what's not? And second, what is the impact of pornography? How is our modern technology enhanced pornified culture shaping us? And third, what, if anything, should we do about it? And so I thought maybe we can start with Pamela, because in your book, you often mention that people who talk about porn or support porn may not realize what it actually is today. Is porn qualitatively different today from 20 years ago, say?
I think it is, and I think that even back then there were misconceptions and misrepresentations of what pornography is. We tend to conflate pornography with sex and say, well, if you're anti-pornography, you must be anti-sex. We tend to think that pornography is harmless entertainment. We have a perception of pornography that I think really differs from the reality, especially when you look at what it was 20 years ago. And I think that there's an entire generation out there, the baby boomers and those who are older, who still think of pornography in terms of gauzy Playboy centerfolds and probably haven't spent a lot of time, particularly on the internet, but also on satellite and cable television and in print media, looking at the way in which pornography has evolved. And I think that, as it has in the past, technology has really pushed pornography and vice versa. It's a kind of chicken and egg situation, but it's pushed it to new extremes. And it's, I think, disingenuous to talk about pornography as mere sexual expression or as a celebration of sex, when if you look at what's actually out there, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to do so. You can go online. It takes about 10 minutes to get a pretty good sense. What you see is often a very negative representation, a commercialized representation of a particular point of view about sex. And it's often a very negative view. And what's ironic is when you talk about pornography and you critique it, you are written off as a prude or as anti-sex, and a lot of the pornography is really prudish and anti-sex. Sex is depicted as something that's dirty, that needs to be over and done with and sort of put away, something that's private. The women in pornography are often, when they're depicted as being sexually voracious, they're then punished for their desires. And so a lot of what is actually in pornography, I think, is quite anti-sex.
What are we talking about exactly? What are the extremes that we're talking about? What are the things that people who talk about porn don't know about porn today?
Well, we're on C-SPAN. What can I say? I will try to bring out my euphemisms. One of the interesting things when I was conducting the interviews that I did for my book, which were primarily with men, interviews that often lasted for days, because surprisingly to me, men were very eager to talk about pornography. They hadn't actually asked themselves, well, what is it that I like about the 3 Asian women in the bathtub? Or, why do I like to see women tortured and multiple penetration scenes in which the woman is depicted as unwilling? And one of the things that surprised me is I asked a question of everyone that I interviewed, do you like bukkake? And nobody said, what's that? And I'll just try to politely describe what bukkake is. It's a Japanese form of pornography. It's now very popular in the United States. There's huge subgenres of bukkake. But the main component is it depicts multiple men ejaculating on a woman's face, and she's shown crying during this. And that's become enormously popular. I heard many men admitted to enjoying this. A lot of them would, sort of give specifics. Well, I don't like it when it's, too many men, or I like it when she's crying, but then she sort of seems happy afterwards. But it's, again, I think very different from what most people think of when they think about porn, and they think of, oh, you know, just depictions of consensual sex, and that this is sort of a happy, liberated view of sexuality.
But in general, you're making an argument in your book that pornography has become very extreme.
Well, you know, it's not only my argument, it's actually something that purveyors of pornography will openly admit when you talk to people, and what people say at the Adult Video News forum. You know, when you look at pornography, you become inured to sort of the basic images. It's like any kind of form of entertainment. You know, when you look at a violent movie, you know, just to see a plain old car crash isn't very exciting to audiences anymore. You have to see the car crash into a truck, and it has to be on a railroad track with a helicopter flying overhead in order to elicit any kind of response from the viewer. And the same thing happens with porn. It has to become more and more extreme in order to continue to contain users' interests. And this is something that pornographers know, and they say openly, yes, it's gotten a lot more extreme, and we have to do this because this is what the audience wants. And when I talk to men about the way in which they use pornography, the vast majority of them said, you know, I started off with print, and frankly, once I got into video, online especially, the print was really boring, and it just didn't get me off anymore. And once they got into video, then it wasn't just one-on-one. They had to see group sex. Then they had to see very often a demeaning or violent component to it, whether that was genital torture or S&M or some you know, rape reenactments. It depends on the taste of the particular user. But they often remarked, you know, for themselves that they did tend to upgrade, not only in how often they wanted to look at it or needed to look at it, but in the kind of pornography that they sought out.
Mm-hmm. I'll go along the line here. Nadine, when we were talking on the phone about your book, Defending Pornography, mm-hmm. you said to me that that wasn't your preferred choice of title, and that you would have rather had it be Defending Free Speech. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you pointed out was that free speech is a tool that can be used by pornographers or feminists alike, and that that censorship is something that's also been used in recent cases to, for example, seize feminist literature or gay literature. And my question for you is, given what Pamela's described, is there anything in the way that pornography has evolved that concerns you, or anything that's changed in the last 20 years that would make a civil libertarian think twice?
Absolutely not. And the reason I made the disclaimer to Katie about the somewhat misleading title of the book, that I, as a first-time author, didn't have the free speech right to choose the title, is unlike other panelists here, I'm not a cultural critic. I don't pretend to have any expertise about the precise content of what is available, let alone who is looking at what. For me, what is at stake is a principle that absolutely does not change. That is defending freedom of choice for all mature men and women, both to perform for whatever they choose to perform for, right? If any of those women or men was forced or coerced, even subtly, of course, that's a violation of their civil liberties. But if they are choosing affirmatively to earn their living that way, that is also their freedom. And I also defend freedom for all mature individuals to make their own decisions about what they choose to see and read. So the only limit is with respect to children. You know, very immature children cannot make their own choices. I say very immature because when you get to be a teenager, certainly you do have the right to go online to look at what some people might well condemn as pornography. And I know that that P word, which has, and not that P word, the four-letter P word, which has no legal definition at all, is a word that everybody uses to describe whatever it is that they don't like in the realm of the sexually explicit. It has become an epithet. As one wit put it, what turns me on is erotica. What turns you on is pornography. And that said, I defend the right of all these people to choose, no matter how disgusting other people might find the images to be. So the principle absolutely has not changed at all. And I do have to say that that P-word epithet has been used against Planned Parenthood's website, and websites that give information about lesbian and gay sexuality, about websites that give information to women about their reproductive health and options. So we have to be very, very careful if we let the standard of some people think it's offensive become a standard. And I understand you're not advocating censorship, but that's why I say we can't tolerate censorship, no matter how offensive some images might be to some of us.
Right. So I had a conversation with Ariel before this panel, and we talked about the difficulty of the problem of actually invoking porn when you're critiquing it, and the problem of, you know, what do you say and what do you not say. And I want everyone to feel free to use whatever euphemisms they want, but I also find it somewhat absurd if we don't allow ourselves also to use the words that we want to use.
On cable TV, we're free, because one of the absurdities is on broadcast we would be bleeped, but not on cable.
Right. So I'm not actually clear which P word you were talking about there. Just I'm not sure if anyone else
I was talking about, the porn word as opposed to penis, right?
Oh, okay. Good. I'm glad we cleared that one up. I just wanted to follow up with one question. So when we talked on the phone, we talked about
that
the
broke the ice, didn't it? See, now they're getting what they want.
Five, I know, I can't count very well.
So when we were talking on the phone, you brought up the ACLU's definition of what where the line for regulation would be, which is an intentional incitement to imminent violence.
Well, that's not only the ACLU's definition. That is actually the standard that the United States Supreme Court has used, that no expression, whether it's sexual expression, pornography, or anything else, is absolutely protected. But where the line is drawn is if there is some very serious harm that is going to be caused immediately by the expression, and there is no less restrictive way of preventing the harm other than suppressing the speech. So the classic kinds of harm are intentional incitement to imminent violence, and the famous example you've all heard is falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, right? And we cause a panic, and some of you might get trampled. And the other classic example is a threat, right? Because even a threat where the person who receives the threat reasonably believes that that it's serious, because then you immediately feel as if you're harmed. Your freedom of movement is already impaired. And I don't think either of those applies to any sexual expression.
Mm-hmm. My follow-up question really is, so that's a clear distinction, but what happens when the culture, is there a point where the culture moves in such a direction that it's very hard to distinguish what that would be? I mean, if you have a culture that's, if you buy Pamela's argument that we have a truly pornified culture, and that pornography has become, as she describes it in her book, incredibly hardcore and incredibly mainstream, have we not moved to a point where that perception of danger or assault is now something that we just accept implicitly, that we don't even question or notice anymore? Is there a point?
There is a really clear distinction between saying our culture is changing in such a way that women are degraded, and therefore men have a negative attitude toward women, and therefore it's more likely that a man may commit an assault against a woman. All of that speculative reasoning about some potential harm sometime in the future is not a justification for suppressing speech. That used to be, it's called the bad tendency speech, right? Speech might have a bad tendency that might at some point in the future lead to bad attitudes, that might lead to bad conduct. If that was the standard that was used back in the early 20th century when we were censoring socialists and communists, because that expression might lead to disrespect for capitalism, which might lead to an overthrow of the United States government. If we have that much of an attenuated connection between this speech and the potential harm, concrete harm, then we'd have no free speech at all. So really what the law demands, and I think is completely appropriate, is a tight and direct causal connection between the speech. There's no time to intervene, to change people's attitudes, to come forward with more positive images. And we also realize that human beings are independent agents. The fact that they see an image doesn't mean it's going to have immediately translated into how that person acts.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to skip over and come back to you, just because that seems to be a nice segue into to Ariel and what your argument is in your book. One of the things that you talk about in your book is the way that pornography has just permeated our culture, and what is the line now between pornography and, say, a cardio striptease class that you can take at Crunch, or Jenna Jameson on the bestseller list, or stripper poles in your bedroom, or any of the millions of other examples that you give in your really tittillating book. And one of the things that you pointed out, which I found really interesting, was that Tracy Kwan, who is used to write a column for Salon, right?
Uh-huh.
And she has a book, a diary of a
Manhattan Call Girl. Yeah.
And she
It's another
shared
one
an
from
author event at Barnes & Noble with William Rehnquist, and then said afterwards, if that's not being part of the establishment, I don't know what is.
Wow.
So my question for you is, your definition of raunch culture is really, it's like a hotness definition, which you define
Right.
as sort of sexy and consumerist.
Well, it's like I'm even sloppier. You know, she was saying that, like, people will say, what I like is erotica, what you like is porn. I'm even sloppier than that. I just said, okay, I'm going to make up a word that sort of covers just this spread of the aesthetic and the ethos of, you know, porn or a red light district into the mainstream. And so now we have raunch culture.
Well, is there a distinction now between pornography and everything else that you talk about in your book? I mean, what is pornography if pornography is everything?
Well, it's like a tree falls in the forest kind of question. Like, I mean, I think that pornography is sort of, in its ethic, the inspiration for so much of what I see in the culture. I mean, I think what was sort of interesting and disturbing to me about the culture right now is how much we've sort of emphasized performance as opposed to personal pleasure in what we view as sexuality. And I think that, you know, if that's the way you're thinking about sex, then it makes perfect sense that Jenna Jameson's going to be on the best. In case anybody doesn't know, Jenna Jameson is the top-selling adult film star on planet Earth. And so, you know, if you're thinking about performance and not pleasure, she's who you want to read on the bestseller list. Paris Hilton, who is, you know, going to be your social emblem, who you want on the cover of Vanity Fair, you're going to go to the gym for cardio or striptease classes because, you know, what we're doing is imitating women whose job it is to fake lust. So, I mean, to me, the difference between, you know, the panel that they had here back then was that at that point, porn and anything related to it was really seen as something private and kind of trashy. And even when Inside Deep Throat came out and, you know, there were articles in the newspaper about porn chic, it was still something that feminists, you know, were picketing outside the theaters, whereas now you have women actively embracing this trend and participating not just by, you know, flashing for Girls Gone Wild, but being behind the cameras too, making a lot of these cultural products as well. So I was interested in why women are embracing this now, why we've sort of taken everything that feminism once reviled and decided to rename it, you know, and reappropriate it supposedly as the emblems of our liberation.
Mm-hmm. Not all feminism reviled it, though.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it depends which aspect. I mean, I think that even if you were a feminist and you were, you know, however you want to put it, pro-sex, pro-porn, I think you still probably were interested in the idea that there should be a multiplicity of ways female sexuality can be conceived of and represented. And I think what we've done now is boiled it down to something extremely commercial, you know, this particular and particularly commercial shorthand for sexiness. So it's not that it should be censored. You know, I'm starting from everything you said to me is, like, obviously you're right. But why? Why are we holding this up as the ultimate in earthy sexuality when it's really, you know, polyester implants and, I mean, polyester underpants and implants, rather, it's not a particularly titillating, smoldering, varied view of sexuality in my modest opinion.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I want to go back to Nelson now, because one of the things that I think is really interesting is the transfer of pornography from something that is seemingly male terrain to something that's been, in your book at least, totally feminized, appropriated, whether in terms of liberation or old objectification or whatever it is, somehow incredibly feminized. And I noticed it in my own peer group, which is why your book was so interesting. It didn't seem to me like some far-off thing that's happening for a small sector of the population. It seemed to me that it's something that's very recognizable, even in my own take on culture, erotica, pornography, whatever, and really sort of opened my eyes. Wow, there's been some sort of transfer where I'm viewing something that would have been seen as trashy, trashy or old-fashioned and unliberated, and now I'm looking at it in this very different way. And it was the first time, really, well, maybe this year, really, but when your book came out, really, that I've begun to start questioning why that is. And that I want to bring the question of transfer to go back to Nelson.
Well, you know, listening to everyone speak here, maybe I have a slightly different take on it. Everyone's looking at porno as the model for why the culture has moved. And maybe what I'm about to say relates to that as a direct correlation, but I say stripping. To me, stripper culture, I don't see young girls wanting to be porn stars. I do see young girls wanting to be strippers. And stripper culture has an economic component to it. That is, stripping has become a way for working class girls to make money and to move out of their conditions, to feed their kids. And I've actually had debates with high school girls about what they wanted to do in the future. And they said they're going to be strippers. And not a couple of them. I mean, like a considerable percentage who see it as a stepping stone to other things. I don't find girls saying they want to be a porn star, because but the stripping thing, which is a step away perhaps, is definitely permeated the culture. A lot of it comes through music. The music video culture that sort of dovetails with the increase in porn has glorified the woman's body and the use of the woman's body in a very sexual way. I mean, when I was growing up, I never saw a gyrating behind, okay? I mean, maybe in one Ed Sullivan show, there'd be a dancer there, right? But
No, they showed Elvis Presley only above the waist, remember?
so maybe if you watch Soul Train, you might have seen a little gyration. Now the same kid who's 13-year-old me sees gyrations all day. And in fact, there's a show on BET that comes on at night called Uncut, which is basically the rawest music videos that comes on like 2 o'clock in the morning. It has phenomenal ratings. So I don't know if the porn thing, for me, it's the stripping culture, and part of why it's so prevalent among young women and it spills over is the music video culture supports it highly. Strippers can actually tour. I don't know if people really realize strippers they tour as much as comedians. I know comedian friends of mine who see strippers on the road all the time because they're going from town to town, making money, going from city to city. So there's this weird, I see the connection between the music videos, the stripper culture, the economic drive that leads women to become strippers and makes it a legitimate business and takes the shame away from it. Mm-hmm. And that begins to affect the dancing. I mean, look at the great trilogy, I call it the great trilogy of American Behinds. Britney, J-Lo, and Beyonce. I think they've had more impact on the way women dress and dance than Jenna Jameson, because they're there every day, and there's a porn aesthetic perhaps in some of it, but also some of it is an extension of social dance in another kind of way. I mean, the fact that girls can show their G-string the same way guys show their underwear, is a big change. I don't know if that's porn. I see that more as this kind of sex as a commodity, but not the extreme of commodity, not the extreme of selling their body. Girls, the argument you always get from girls who strip is, I'm in control. I guess that goes back to the porn thing. But they feel, a lot of them draw that line. They're not going to go that far.
They're not going to go that far to actually be
Porn
paid
star.
professionally for
Right.
it. Which is an interesting line to draw, really. It's like you make that point in your book, Ariel, that they'll do all the stuff that a porn star might do, but won't actually be paid for it. I mean, you don't make it in that exact way.
Also, they're safer in a sense. They feel safer because there's actually security at some of these clubs, and they feel like there's a line there.
Well, they are safer. I mean, you have less chance of catching STDs if you're spinning around a pole than if you're having intercourse all the time.
The champagne room is the.
But the real question.
There's a blurry line there in the champagne.
The real question then is the impact on greater culture is the same, because the rhetorical significance of what these women are doing is the same. Pornography or porn star or objectification, whatever it is, whether or not they're actually what they do off screen is beside the point. What they're representing.
But look, America's always been a hypocritical culture about sex. Let's say that. I grew up in a culture, African American culture, where sex was much more readily accepted. That people were sexy. That women dressed sexy. There was a church side to it. There's the dichotomy between the Sunday church service and the Saturday night get down, right? But everyone respected Saturday night get down as part of life. It wasn't like something that was hidden to the side, that people didn't get busy, that people didn't want to dress sexy. White American culture has had a lot harder time grasping that idea of sexuality. And so, to me, what's happened is not necessarily negative in the sense that women are beginning to, white women, let's just say, are embracing their sexuality more. I do think that the spectacle of it has shaken people to an amazing degree. That's part of the rock and roll revolution. That's part of what hip hop has brought to the play. So we are in a more sexual culture. Is it totally wrong? Is it totally a bad thing? I'm not totally sure it is. I do think that there are the bukkake things. It's crazy. Anybody who's seen bukkake knows that that's like, what is that? It's really crazy stuff. So, I mean, there's a line I won't go, and that bukkake stuff is definitely part of some other stuff. But the sexualization of the culture, I don't necessarily think that that's all wrong or all bad.
Right. Before I move on, I just want to say one of the things that we talked about that was really interesting to me was, hip-hop, which is something you know more about than probably anyone I've met. And it's a predominantly male genre with a few exceptions. And the reason that you said is because the viewers of hip-hop are primary, the main audience is 15 to 25-year-old men, and I quote you, who's hornier than that? So,
well, one other thing we should say about hip-hop and related to this discussion is most hip-hop records are purchased by white males. Absolutely positive. It's a known fact in the record industry, and by a lot. And just when you have an Eminem or Jay-Z or fill-in-the-blank guy selling over 1-2 million records, they're selling predominantly to white males, and with young white women as well as part of that. So when you look at a Luther Campbell, who we talked about earlier, who's actually the poster child for the sexualization of hip-hop, you're talking about a guy whose appeal was not just for black kids in the hood, but for white frat boys. And so, again, I go back, I think that the sexualization of culture is not just porn. It's out there and in many different forms in the culture. And again, maybe because I'm a man, I'm not necessarily against the idea of girls gyrating their behinds. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I do think that there are places where I think that what we're talking about is the most extreme parts of it that freak people out, and it should. But for our culture to be more accepting of sexuality in all of its aspects is something America's desperately needed.
I just have to say, since Nelson mentioned Luther Campbell, the reason I knew about him was this was the very first time in American history that there was an obscenity prosecution, a criminal prosecution of a work of music. And it was a famous Two Live Crew case. The ACLU ultimately successfully defended him. But I think that's very interesting given all the sexualization of our culture even back then, that the target happened to be an African-American performer who was seen as reaching a white audience.
Absolutely. I mean, go ahead, please.
No, I'm curious because as those of you who are familiar with my book, you know that I don't advocate censorship, and I think that the whole way in which the debate has been framed between banning it or exalting it, I think has really overlooked the true impact of pornography. But I'm curious about your earlier discussion about obscenity, where you didn't mention obscenity in Miller versus California, and how they also define pornography, although they use the word obscenity. And you said that the one restriction on speech was the fire, the hazard. So I'm curious how you view Miller versus California, because I was speaking to I think it was Rodney Smola, and he said that basically when you look at the pornography that's out there today, 80% of it would be prosecutable under Miller versus California, that it qualifies as obscenity. So I'm interested to know how
I want to get back to that question because I want to get to Kay, but I do think that's a great question, and it's still in the same line of what is pornography today and what's obscene today. But I wanted to get to you, Kay, and also because we were talking about the impact on young people and the development of pornography in the context of how it shapes our identity, and you've written about that.
Right. I really want to think about what it's like to come of age in a pornified culture. Because, as we all know, children are very influenced by their surroundings. I don't want to make the argument that you hear so often that somehow if children are exposed to anything, these poor little innocent creatures are going to be sullied or corrupted. I don't believe that at all. And this is probably dating me, but I remember when I was growing up, there was this book that was on my parents' bookshelf that was faced in, so that you couldn't see the cover. But it was the Kinsey Report, and that book was very well thought through by the entire family. I happen to know. I don't believe it did any either me or my brother or sister much harm. So that's not my argument. My argument, though, is that children it's not that they're innocent, and I've raised 3 kids, so I know they're not innocent, but they are unshaped and they are ignorant. And they come into this world and they're trying to figure out, okay, what are the rules? What am I supposed to make of this world? And what concerns me about this pornified culture is that the message that's getting through to kids is that we're supposed to think that sex is like this. Now, I don't think that the consequence of that is necessarily that kids are going to get to be 16 and then they're going to want to imitate the bukkake scenario, although maybe they will. But I think that's almost too blunt. I don't know that there's a kind of direct imitation that goes on always. Sometimes I'm sure there is. But the bigger problem, I think, is what the pornified culture says about sex. And it seems to me that it reduces sex to something that's just merely about physical pleasure, completely divorced from any kind of meaning or larger emotional experience. I'm going to disagree with some of the other people on the panel. I don't think this is just a product of porn. I think this has been developing ever since the sexual revolution and feminism came on the scene, because the ideal that we began to hear formulated at that time was that the liberation had to do with being independent, autonomous, disconnected, expressing yourself by yourself. And not, what it meant was that the partner or the sexual partner becomes a kind of tool or an object. That's the danger. And something that I think we see a lot of. It seems to me that the really difficult thing, one of the really difficult things about growing up in this culture is finding a way to be capable of intimacy. We take it for granted that that should happen. It's not a natural thing. I think it's a great individual and cultural achievement when it happens. And the culture, it seems to me, has to be more supportive of those kinds of relationships, because I think that's where people find happiness, and not from being able to shake their booties. I think, yeah, that can be fun sometimes, that's fine, but that's not where the deeper sources of happiness and meaning are. And what concerns me is that we get distracted by these images of the hot, of the hot girl, of the raunch girls, who think, well, that's what it means to be, a cool girl today, and they grow up and think, that's what I want to be, that's what I should be.
Okay, you're saying that the images reflect the culture as well as vice versa, that it's a cyclical kind of relationship.
Yes, but I think, so my argument is always about the culture, and it seems to me that what fascinated me about Pamela's book, and Ariel's actually, is that we now are hearing from a younger generation, at least from my vantage point, of people who are saying, well, wait a minute, isn't there another vocabulary here? For so long, this discussion has been in these kind of Scopes trial terms. Either you are a flat earther, or John Ashcroft, or an abstinence promoter, or Comstock, or something like that, or you believe in freedom. And those were the only two possibilities. And it seems to me that what we're learning is that the freedom by itself was not enough, and that the culture, and by that I mean the stories that are being told, the movies that are being made, the images that we see, that the culture is not supporting the possibility of a deeper and richer experience.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk in a minute about the impact and maybe some prescriptions, but for now I just want to stick with definitions. And I want to ask you if you want to add anything to that on what is pornography for young people? What are the specifics of experience growing up in this sort of culture?
I don't have a definition for you. I mean, it seems to me that I'm more comfortable just talking about a hypersexualized culture and talking about the effect on kids, not specifically about porn. I think that we're making a distinction here that maybe doesn't have as much import as maybe we're defining.
But maybe I didn't ask that question well enough, but I think one of the things that people, especially people over 30 or over 40, are concerned with today, people who have children are that children are so much more technologically savvy in the particular sorts of technologies that create and disseminate pornography,
Right.
that how do adults even know what's going on? I mean, you know, with a V-chip, what does a V-chip do? You know, children, you know, at age, pretty much everyone here on this panel is familiar with this argument, but the specifics of it, some of which are in your book, you know, cell phone porn, iPod porn, you know, internet porn, the technology for experiencing this aspect of culture is something that young people have and that a lot of old people don't or choose not to access.
Right. But I think that inevitably children's experience of these things is mediated by the family and by the broader culture. In other words, if there is a clear message coming from families, from schools, from the culture at large, that this stuff is really marginal, it's not what we accept as the norm, I think they have a different experience of it. Again, I want to say, it's not that they're exposed to it, you know, the same way I was reading Kinsey when I was, as soon as I could read, I think. You know, but I knew that that was something different. You know, that was sort of a part of life that wasn't, you know, that wasn't what we talked about at the dinner table or how I was going to behave at school or in public or anything like that. So I think I think sometimes, look, it's very difficult raising children in this culture. It puts a tremendous amount of pressure on parents these days. But I think it is doable to, you know, that it really does make a big difference how the parents mediate the culture for their children.
You know, it's almost like there's no childhood. I mean, I have a niece who's 8, and I spend a lot of time with her. And when you look at what she consumes, how she's marketed to, the way we sell things to young people, children, is become more sexualized because sexualization suggests maturity. And kids want to grow up rapidly. And so the idea of buying the snakeskin, skin-tight, fat farm jeans at 8 or 9 is very attractive because it suggests I'm getting closer to this other thing out here much faster. I mean, I look at this, I think the marketing of culture is driving all of this. Part of it is the fact that young males, white, black, whatever, are the target group for so many products. How do you reach these guys? You use sex. And that's permeated every form of selling. It's hard to find any product that doesn't use that tool.
You know, that's really, it's
or
really...
maybe not, you know, objectification of the female body, more precisely.
I think also, though, that, you know, when we talk about pornography and we say, like, young people are coming into contact with it, we think of, oh, you know, 12-year-old, 13-year-old boys. And that's the group that's always looked at pornography. That's why pornography has so many adolescent images. It's about the prom queen. It's about the Catholic schoolgirl. But the fact is that kids are coming into contact with porn, not just at 8. Nielsen Net Ratings tracks usage among 2 to 6-year-olds visiting quote-unquote adult websites. I met a pediatric nurse who said that.
Sorry, but how do they imagine?
I don't know their methodology.
Try to imagine a 2-year-old's like fingers on the keyboard.
Well, you know,
Exactly. Where the hell are the parents?
Talking about a 2-year-old?
Well, it's often the parents. You know, it's on the parents' computer. That's often how they come into contact with it.
I mean,
You know,
did these surveys say what they take out of
is not a
this
problem when you're 2.
Right. I mean, but what are these kids? I mean, but when you say a 2 or 3-year-old seeing it, what are they getting out of it? I mean, is it damaging?
What do you say to a 2-year-old?
Yeah, I mean,
Bad girl.
yeah, I mean, is it damaging them? I don't know. I mean, I can't. Do you remember what you did at 3 years old? Much less what you know. I mean, I don't know.
The thing that you bring out, though, about the sort of the end of childhood in a way, that children at age 2 or 6 are already being treated to these very adult fare is really interesting, though, because it's something that I've paid a lot of attention to. This concept but there's an interesting dichotomy because, you know, childhood is often talked about as a 19th century invention, a creation that happened with the Industrial Revolution. So kids stayed at home because it used to be 300 or 400 years ago that you went straight from swaddling clothes to adult gear and you were sent out in the field, hard labor, or you were married at age 11 or 12 if you were an aristocrat, boom, full adult. And then, you know, in the 19th century, kids stayed home. There was an expansion of the age of childhood. And then really teenager is an American word from the mid-20th century. And one thing that's really interested me as I hit my 30s, I started noticing how many 30-plus-year-olds there were on television that were doing nothing related to an adult life. Sex and the City, Seinfeld, Will and Grace, you know, what other shows are there? There's a zillion Friends, where there are all these like people who have pushed childhood or adolescence well beyond the age of normal childhood or adolescence, biological, whatever. You're pushing right up to menopause, you're still doing the and I think that's really interesting to note that simultaneously there's been this marketing of adult fare to 2- and 6-year-olds. It's like now we've got this enormous period of time, which is really like adolescence, which should be a short period of time when you're, well, I don't know if it should be, but what maybe I think of as that period of time, which has now been extended from age 2 to age 40. If you count Desperate Housewives, who are still sort of children, you might even go beyond that.
The other thing that happens with adolescents that I think is significant is that while they're inundated with this culture, and whether it starts with porn or strippers, I mean, whatever it is, it's there, and it's raunchy, and it's always about women performing this one ritual of sexiness. They are equipped with very little information with which to grasp this, because over 80% of the public schools that offer sex ed in this country just say no to sex and teach abstinence only. So there's not a lot of information with which to process
that's
that.
accurate, actually.
It's
not abstinence only. They may be teaching abstinence plus, which is a different.
I've heard it's a serious number. I've heard the number 1/3, because our federal government is funding, and literally it means if you get the federal money, you may only teach abstinence. And the only thing you can teach about condoms is a completely distorted alleged failure rate of condoms. And the only thing that you can teach about lesbian and gay sexuality is that you're exposed to AIDS. I mean, it's very dangerous misinformation, and one of the reasons why I'm so opposed to censoring anything in this area. Again, I know nobody's advocating it, but I'm nervous because the information or the critique that's put out can be used by others. It's not a reason to censor the information that you're putting out, but I get very nervous about where policymakers are going to be taking this.
Yeah, I've done a little work on this issue, and there is a lot to be concerned about with abstinence education. But one thing that I've noticed, first of all, it's not one thing. There are like 700 curriculums, and they are enormously varied. But one thing that is very striking to me about the curriculums that I've looked at is that there is an attempt to do something that comprehensive sexual education was not doing, and that is to try to place sex in a broader understanding of what is your life goal. What kind of partner do you, or husband or wife, do you want eventually? How do you imagine, finding that person? How do you judge that person? So they are doing something that I think was missing in the more mainstream, it used to be at any rate, sex education. Unfortunately, we're in this environment that's so polarized that it's again this scopes trial terms where, if it's abstinence education, then it must be just for flat earthers.
Do you think that's best case scenario if the teacher is taking the time to actually put sex in this larger context? I mean, so many of the teens I interviewed didn't get anything like that. All they got was, don't do it until you're married.
Do I think that sex education has ever been taught well?
Right.
No.
Right.
Okay, so
we're talking about the public schools here.
Right.
Let's come back to that in a minute, because I want to just follow up with a question you raised about obscenity, which that could take up the entire panel. So I just want to confine it to the two of you really briefly. And I want to just remark, when I was reading up on this, I just came across, probably maybe it was in your book, that in 1975, the Supreme Court ruled that oral sex can be a crime against nature. Was that in your book?
I don't think that's quite accurate, but in 1986, the Supreme Court upheld, against a constitutional challenge, a law outlawing any oral or anal sex even between a married heterosexual couple. That was just overturned a couple of years ago.
So the question of obscenity just is vast, and what it is really and what it's not can come to extremes that seem absurd. But Pamela,
that was a really good question. I was responding directly to Katie's question: what line do I consider to be appropriate, and the ACLU to consider to be appropriate? And what I described is true for every category of expression except for sexually oriented expression, where the Supreme Court has created this anomaly, the so-called obscenity exception. You're absolutely right that they last visited in 1973, in this case called Miller versus California, which was decided 5-4, very controversial. The overwhelming majority of law professors think that there is no constitutional justification for it. basically the Supreme Court said, even if there's no evidence of any harm whatsoever from this expression, we believe that it lowers the moral tone of the community. And I was thinking about that actually in response to Katie's question about what about this other kind of harm. It's exactly that inchoate damage to the tone of the community, the coarsening, the vulgarization of the community that was the rationale for the obscenity exception. The reason why I disagree with Rod Smala, whom I otherwise generally agree with when he says that a lot of what we see could be prosecuted as obscenity, is that it's got a three-part definition, and I think because of the changes that we've all been talking about, it would be very hard to satisfy any three of those parts of the definition. The first one is that the material has to be, it has to appeal to the prurient interest in sex, and that's defined by the contemporary community standards. And prurient, for those of you who don't know what it means, the Supreme Court later went back and said that means a morbid or sick interest in sex as opposed to a normal and healthy interest in sex. So you can tell how objective that definition is.
And that basically describes the history of rock and roll.
But I think from what you're saying, what the cultural experts are saying is there wouldn't be too many juries who, if they were honest, would find that too many things satisfied that. The second criterion, I think, would also be equally hard to satisfy from what you're saying, and that is that the material be patently offensive according to contemporary community standards.
And that would be the history of hip-hop.
Yeah, right. You know, so if everybody's watching it, how can they voluntarily, how can they say it's patently offensive? And the third one, which is defined by national standards, is it cannot have any serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And that's why things like music and art get off the hook.
That was justification of the 2 Live Crew case in Florida. I mean, all this language you just described is so, I mean, it's rock and roll, it's hip-hop, it's all these cultural expressions. That's why this whole debate is so shaky, because the language just does not work to define these things properly.
What do you mean the language does not work?
Period interest. Chuck Berry was period interest, and so was Little Richard. NWA is period interest. I mean these arguments, so when you've been using these phrases, you can apply them to such a large section of what culture is that they're not useful in defining the things that you may be most problematic.
Do you think the language could be improved to be useful, or do you think that there is no language that's useful in this sort of...
There's no language, because the culture shifts, and we try to move the language to address the culture, and the culture moves some more. We have these phrases that were created to define a moment or a piece of work under attack, but they don't work because pop culture, popular culture, is constantly moving and shifting. What was the most outrageous thing in this culture is now, I mean, porn. We go back to the Jenna Jameson thing. There's a book that was a bestseller this year on the New York Times bestseller list called Confessions of a Video Vixen, which is sort of the Jenna Jameson for the hip-hop generation, of a girl who was a
she renounces it.
They all renounce it. Jenna Jameson, at the end of her book...
Jenna Jameson is still carrying
No,
the flag in that book.
but if you read Jenna Jameson's book, she's always like, well, I feel conflicted, I really shouldn't have done it. There's a lot of remorse. I saw Judith Reagan and oh no, it's really not what you think it is. It's all about her transformation. But everyone uses the language they use to sell what they can sell.
The problem with the language is that even putting aside cultural shifts and geographical variations, even the very same community at the very same moment in history, people are going to be conflicted. And the 2 Live Crew cases, you may remember, there were 2 prosecutions for the exact same work, as nasty as they want to be. And in both in Broward County, Florida, in the very same year, one was a jury case and one was a judge case, and for the very same piece of music, they came back with completely opposite verdicts. And so I think the only honest definition is the one that everybody has heard from Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart when he said, I cannot define it, but I know it when I see it. So we have to make that decision for ourselves.
So I want to, so we're going to have to move along. I just want to say, for anyone who doesn't actually know the specifics of that was a 1990 case, right, Nelson? The 2 Live Crew, nasty as they want to be. And the federal judge declared it obscene, making it the first U.S. recording group that was banned for minors. based on indecency.
You could get arrested for selling it. People
Right.
did get arrested for selling it.
And really, and I thought that, Rita, if you look at Nelson's book, he talks a little bit about Luther Campbell, who routinely invited women on stage to strip and actually perform
Luther
oral
Campbell is like a
sex.
central issue character in this discussion because he helped sexualize hip hop. He's the one who brought booty dancing and all that stuff to the fore, and simulated sex acts on stage, and the whole next 10 years, 15 years of music videos were driven by a lot of the aesthetics of what he created. So he's interesting. This guy from Florida, at State again, you know, has a central role in several levels of this discussion, both in terms of hip hop and in terms of pornography. He also, I'll just get off this real quick. Luther keeps coming up. Luther also, there wasn't black pornography as I grew up. There wasn't really black porn in any big numbers until the late 80s. It just didn't exist. There's some correlation between hip hop and that. I'm not quite sure. I'm not going to put the finger on hip hop for that, but certainly pornography and hip hop have been really good bedfellows.
So to speak.
And some of the biggest porn tapes of the last 10 years have featured hip hop art, have been hosted, if you will.
Right.
And produced by hip hop artists.
Yes, in fact, we were discussing on the phone how Snoop Dogg's
Snoop Dogg's
Style
first Doggy
was-
Style video is one of the biggest selling porn DVDs of all time.
Right. So I want to we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to be really disciplined. We let this section of the discussion go quite a while. So I'm just going to ask one or two questions on where we see the impact of this sort of new pornified world, and then I'm going to ask for prescriptions. But I'm going to ask you to be quick and brief. And Ariel, I want to ask you first, because your book really talks about how pornography has, a porno mindset has spread into a more general raunch culture, and you talk about female the title of Ariel's book, Female Chauvinist Pigs. So I want to ask you, well, first of all, I want to ask you what is a female chauvinist pig? And I also wanted you to comment on, well, as I said before, one of the things that I noticed reading your book was how titillating it was, and you mentioned to me right before you called me a pervert that you had the same impression reading Andrea Dworkin.
Yeah.
So my question is, what is that? Does that make us part of raunch culture? Aren't we in some way? I mean, Pamela's here wearing leather pants. I mean, aren't we all? Are we all female chauvinist pigs? My real question is, where is this line? Where is the line, and how much of pornography is seeping into mainstream culture? What is a female chauvinist pig?
Well, the thing, a female chauvinist pig, I mean, it's meant to be funny. Some people think it is. Some people think it's like the most offensive thing they've ever heard. The idea is that if a male chauvinist pig was a guy from years past who treated women like pieces of meat, then female chauvinist pigs of today are women who make sex objects of other women and of themselves and think of this as sexual liberation. And Katie sent me this email where she said, you know, I found parts of your book titillating. What do you think about this? Am I just a pervert? So I emailed her back and I said, you're just a pervert. No, but then I emailed her back and I said, I had the same experience when Andrea Dworkin died, the sort of icon of the anti-sex symbol, the icon of the anti-porn movement. When she died, I wrote an article about her for New York Magazine, and I had the same experience. I would be reading these pages and pages of descriptions of sex acts, and sometimes I felt like I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be offended or masturbating, you know? And I think that, that's okay. I mean, I think that, you know, to what extent you're going to find this stuff titillating, to what extent you're going to participate in it, you know, that has to be grounded in what is pleasurable for you. And the point of my book, and what sort of interests me about this, is how often I talk to young women and grown women who had really taken all the emphasis off of pleasure, whether you define that as simply sexual pleasure or what Kay is saying, an emotional bond, you know, or some kind of intimacy that's going to yield something more profound than an orgasm. However you define it, I felt like there was so much movement away from that and onto just putting on a show of sexiness. And that's the thing. When you were saying earlier, you know, this would be good if what it reflected was that women were just embracing their sexuality. But the thing is, you're only embracing your sexuality if booty dancing really is your authentic way. And I just sort of like, if you play the percentages, right. I just find it unconvincing that this many women, this just happens to be their thing. You know, there's as many ways to be sexual as there are to be human, and I don't think that we've gotten to a place where we just accept sexuality in all its varieties. I mean, you think about the last election when, during wartime, you know, we turned our attention to making an amendment to ban gay marriage, which was already illegal. I mean, I don't think that we're this loose, relaxed society.
No. In fact, we are puritanical and freaked out.
I'm going to have to wrap this up, and I have a couple urgent questions I want to ask. Pamela, I'm going to ask you to be really brief. I'm sorry, this is a big question, but in your book, you really talk about pornography as destroying relationships and marriage and the future of men and women being intimate with each other. And it's interesting because your first book also looked at in a different way at the demise of marriage, the starter marriage. So I want to ask you, is porn really destroying relationships? What are the statistics? What is the evidence of that you have? And I'm giving you 1 minute.
Well, there's no questionnaire that you fill out when you go to divorce court to say that, porn did it. And I don't think you could say, there's a direct causation between, pornography, broke up X number of marriages, although marriage lawyers at their 2003 meeting did say, 60% of those there said that looking at too much internet porn they had found to be a cause in divorces in a way that they had never seen before. That said, I think that, again, you cannot say, porn did it and divorce it from all of the complexities that enter into a relationship. But when I did talk to people about their experience in relationships, and not just in relationships, but to young people who are single, it was clear that pornography had in many ways been a detrimental force in the way they approach sex and the way their partners approach sex. For example, you would talk to a young woman, and there's one woman in my book, I call her Ashley, 24-year-old from Baltimore, and she told me that basically all the guys that she knows looks at porn. They all go to strip clubs on a regular basis. When she goes over to someone's house, there's always copies of Maxim, of Playboy, of all of the, you don't even need Playboy really with Maxim and FHM, et cetera, lying around. And what is this supposed to tell her about the way her boyfriend or potential boyfriend looks at her, about what he expects her to look like, the way that he expects her to behave? And she was in a relationship at the time that we spoke, and her boyfriend would go to a strip club once a month and would get a lap dance. And she said to him, how is it different if you go to a strip club and get a lap dance here? If that woman were doing that to you on our sofa right here, that would be cheating. Why is it okay when it's in a strip club? And I think that a lot of women felt that pornography had really become part of their boyfriends or their husbands' experience of sexuality in a way that then dictated to them or that made them feel in competition with or threatened by what they wanted. And so the other thing I think that is less talked about, because we're so used to talking about pornography's impact on women, is the effect that it has on men. And it was really interesting to me because, again, I was mostly talking to porn fans. These were guys that said they'd had no problem with pornography. These were happy porn users, and yet they were telling me that they had found their ability to have an orgasm with regular sexual intercourse had diminished, that often they had to emulate the money shot, if you were all familiar with that from pornography. They would have to ejaculate on their girlfriend or wives or whoever they were sleeping with that night's face or breasts in order to achieve the same satisfaction that they had before they started looking heavily at particularly internet porn. Trying to wrap it up. Okay.
Yeah, so
many sexual problems.
in fact, I hope we'll get back to this maybe with one of the audience questions, because I know you have some prescriptions. And in fact, I'd like to invite people who have questions to come up, please, and line up in front of this microphone. And I'm going to ask one more last question before we start audience questions. And I wanted to ask it of Nadine. I'm sorry, we'll get back and we'll ask more here. But particularly, I want to ask Nadine, porn is everywhere now. This whole battle that has pit, sort of feminists and Republicans against the perverts and the civil libertarians about whether we should regulate porn. Is there any point in regulating porn now? I mean, is this argument totally moot? One of the things you said is it's not moot because broadcast is one of the sort of holdout areas of our hypocrisy. We saw that with the Janet Jackson fiasco. Okay. So that's my question. I just want to say, where is this argument on censorship? Does it exist?
Yeah. Well, there are still constant attempts to censor, not only through using the obscenity law that the Supreme Court has refused to find unconstitutional. John Ashcroft was already referred to. While he was Attorney General, he beefed up the resources that the Justice Department is putting into prosecuting obscenity. I mean, at a time when we thought that all of our resources had to be fighting the war on terrorism, I don't think taxpayers realize how many prosecutors are tied up now going after people who are voluntarily performing for and watching sexually oriented expression. On television, there is, as many of you know, censorship through the FCC, which bans even indecent material that is perfectly legal in other media, so that it is true. I would not be able to, I can describe a famous Supreme Court case that involved fuck the draft. When I'm on TV, that gets bleeped out. So, and yet you turn one channel away, you're on cable, and you can be having, you know, extremely sexually explicit material. So talk about hypocrisy and inconsistency. As a result of the famous wardrobe malfunction last year, there was a tremendous amount of political pressure to harmonize the disparate regulation of broadcast and satellite and cable, but by moving away from free speech, so that there are now bills pending that would subject cable and satellite to the same restrictions that are now imposed on broadcast TV. And almost nobody has voted against it on either side of the aisle. It's very politically unpopular to defend freedom for this stuff, even if you know all your constituents are watching it.
I know, and even if we live in a pornified world. I might want to invite the first three people, and we'll take questions in groups of three. So if you could say your question rather quickly, just because there's a lot of people in line, I see. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, that just to start out, I do believe the censorship of porn is almost moot at this point. The cat's out of the bag, it can't happen, and it's not a legal battle, if it is a battle. It's kind of one of survival, at least, you know, as a girl who's dating right now for me. But I also wanted to know, seeing as the porn industry rivals the film industry, as well as the pro sports industry, and how much money that it makes every year, how that relates to maybe, in an analogous way, you know, the cigarette industry targeting people who are very young and getting them addicted at a young age, or, you know, how the money behind the industry is as, you know, fueling the way in which it's overwhelmed our cultures, everything else, and how the companies are not social pioneers, they're profiteers. You know, the guys and the women, you know, who own these companies are out to have 2 to 6-year-olds, you know, see that stuff and get hooked. And, you know, I mean, it could be, Mr. Austin, that is not something that affects them, but it could be that it is. So I was just wondering how you all feel that economics play a part in this process.
We'll take questions in groups of 3. So if the next person could come up.
Thanks. I want to thank Pamela for your focus on relationships. I think that's an important and often forgotten part of this discussion. And my question is, I see similar things that happen with men that get fixated on pornography with the sort of, I mean, in New York it's incredibly prevalent, but where I come from in Virginia, it's very common with sex toy parties. And I see a sort of a corollary among women, not necessarily with porn, but not necessarily exclusive from porn, with the use of sex toys, which on the one hand I'm in favor of, you know, exploration and whatever, but you know, the use of sex toys and pornography are largely solitary activities. And so I don't know that, well, I don't know, maybe men would say that women's increasing use of sex toys has affected the way women look at sex and men as potential sex objects. But I was wondering if someone could address that, because it seems to me sort of like the women's part of this increasing objectification of sex.
Mm-hmm.
First, I'm just going to make a brief statement, and then I'm going to ask my question. I think it was Kay, you mentioned before that you're not sure what exactly young women or young men face in what we're calling a porn culture, and I just would like to say that when you step into a child store and the only dolls that are really for sale are Barbie with her huge boobs and those Bratz dolls with their extremely sexual appearance, whether that's right or wrong, I'm not saying, I'm just saying those are the only choices, and you go into Limited Too and Kohl's, which is a very mainstream store, and then you have Juicy written on a 12-year-old's butt, and cleavage shirts and things like that. And also, when you go into high school and discussions of anal sex are geared towards, well, yeah, that feels good, not, oh my God, what are the dangers for the female? Or the G-string, it's not men's underwear, it's vaginitis, yeast infections. Like, these are not, this is just one option that mainstream stores are providing, so that's just a backdrop of youth culture. And my question is, you made a good point, all of you made a good point that there's one point of view in pornography. And I'm wondering how, without embracing that one point of view of silicone and fakeness and hurting women or whatever is projected in this porn world, is there any way to expand our higher conscious of what we view against what we're viewing? And is there also any way that we can change pornography? Not erotica, because there's a lot of room for that, but pornography, is there any way to make it more women-friendly, user-friendly? I don't know. So.
Okay, so the first question was about the profiteering, porn profiteering for 2-year-olds. The second was the solitary activities, sex toys and porn, and what's the woman's role. And sorry to truncate and simplify. And the third, is there a way to expand or change pornography in a more women-centric way? And I'm just going to invite whoever wants to respond.
There's been many attempts by female filmmakers to make more female-friendly porn, and that's been going on for quite a while. I think there is a market for it that does exist, but the core audience for porn is still men, and that's what's driving the industry. It's funny, your comment you made about the men going to strip clubs. I mean, I definitely believe that that experience has a very negative effect on men's relationship with women. I mean, I know a lot of guys who spend a lot of time in strip clubs. And there's something about sitting in a strip club, watching these, and the looks on men's faces. I don't know if you've ever watched men in a strip club. They look lobotomized.
Well, it's interesting when you
They
talk
really
to
do.
guys about when they go to strip clubs, they say, well, all the other guys there are total losers. I'm nothing like them. But, you know, I want to respond to, I think the questions that they asked were related. And I do disagree on one ground, which is I think that pornography actually is incredibly varied. I think there's an enormous range of what's out there. You know, when I talk to guys about what kind of porn they looked at, one guy said, well, it's kind of like picking out what kind of ice cream I want that, you know, night. Do I want strawberry, vanilla, or chocolate? You know, do I want amateur porn? Do I want lesbian porn? Do I want, you know, anal porn? And they'll flip through and choose. And there are many women who produce pornography, and there are people who produce so-called women's-friendly pornography. And I think that one of the interesting things, again, is I just want to ground this in reality. I would talk to women, and they would say, well, you know, I look at porn with my boyfriend or my husband or whoever, and I suggest it because I know that he's really into it, and I want to seem like I'm sex positive and like I'm adventurous, and that he'll think I'm really sexy if I propose looking at it. So I'll pick out stuff that I think he'll like, and then we'll watch it together. And then you talk, you know, and then women will say, I don't really get off on it. You know, I kind of get off on the fact that he gets off on the fact that he thinks I'm getting off on it, and sometimes I think it's funny. And then you talk to the guy, and he'll say, yeah, my girlfriend, wife, whoever, suggested that we look at porn, and I guess I thought that was kind of cool. But to be totally honest with you, the stuff that she picked out, I don't find a turn on at all. There's, you know, it's just too boring, it's slow, there's too much plot, and I watch it for her sake. But then when I really want to look at, I go and look at it on my own. So it's really interesting that something that two people think that they're doing to improve their relationship somehow is actually, there's no communication going on, and I don't think it's improving either of their sex lives.
Yeah, why don't Kay?
I wanted to talk a little bit about the economics that you
Yeah, I
were
thought that
on
was a
me
great
at that
point.
time, and actually bring in the Barbie business, because Barbie came on the market in, I think it was 1959, and she was modeled after a German doll that was modeled on a cartoon prostitute. Named, Lily, was it Lily? And you know, Mattel designed this doll with this German doll in mind, and they turned her into a little California girl with, you know, made it a little more like a surfer girl. But at any rate, when they test marketed the Barbie on the public, the mothers hated it. They were so upset that that Mattel was now going to market this thing to their daughters. But of course it became a gold mine, as it continues to be today, I guess. But what I was going to say is, so even then we're dealing with this marketing problem. And there, you know, the question is, well, what do we do about it? These guys people are making money off of it. There's no question about it, and that's why they're doing it. But I think that there still is more that the public can do. And the fact is, when there is public outrage, these guys back off because they don't like the publicity. So Abercrombie & Fitch, for instance, was forced to take they had a catalog, I think it was, from about a year ago, was it? That was
Porn-centric.
soft porn,
Yeah.
you know. And people, there was an outcry about it, and they took it off the market. Same thing. So, you know, it seems to me that really, you know, there should be more of that, and people shouldn't feel.
On our side as consumers too.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think the law is not a very effective instrument in dealing with this.
So I'd like to invite the next three people to come up. With the woman who had the comment about relating porn and sports and cigarettes and profiteering to two-year-olds, please come up, the next three. I just wanted to say I think that that's an excellent question, and we should continue to think about that. I would love to hear a response. If not regulation, then what? Should it be like a culture of greater, should we be cultivating a greater culture of disgust, or what are, because I think all of us would agree that we don't really want, you know, the profiteering sort of mindset on two-year-olds. We don't want two-year-olds being sold dildos.
I wanted to answer that if I can. That's actually the definition of illegal sexual content that Justice Scalia is pushing for. He wants to call it pandering, and I totally disagree with it, but I want to put it out there for your consideration, that you shouldn't judge it by the content, but you should judge it by how it's being pushed, including the audience, yeah, so to speak, thrusting.
Thrusting is a term, by the way, that actually came up in the Harper's debate 20 years ago, and it means when, for example, a billboard is right in your face and you can't avoid it. So, and actually, I should ask you whether you are in favor or against. Ari Nair actually said that he would say that that's fine.
The concept is if there's a captive audience that can't avoid seeing a certain expression. I think if you're going out into a public place like Times Square, you have to take whatever is there. You know, you're on notice that you're going to hear political speech you disagree with as well as other forms of speech you disagree with. I don't like that exception outside of the home or perhaps the workplace where you have no choice to be.
Right. He was the previous president?
Executive
director of the ACLU, and he had actually said in the earlier debate that that was one form of regulation that he could agree to.
And I thought Al Goldstein had a wonderful response, which was to Susan Brown Miller, well, what about all the, you know, feminist magazines and people who are against abortion think that that's advocating murder
Exactly.
of babies?
I would be more than happy, he said, I would be more than happy to put the porn magazines on the back shelf if you would be willing to put Ms. Magazine and all those terrible abortion advocating feminist magazines on the back shelf too. Next, three.
I asked this question as a Korean woman who is offended by stereotypes of the erotic Asian woman and her body being eroticized in Western media and culture. What are your views on pornography as violence against women and as perpetuating oppressive, racist, sexist, patriarchal systems in which we still live? I'm sure I don't need to remind everyone that pornography is one of the only industries that actively and blatantly accepts and promotes racist stereotypes of women and sexism.
Next.
Hi. My question is a comment and a two-part question. We are living in this very hypersexualized culture, but it's underscored currently by this conservatism. And I'm just really fascinated what you might think about is, you know, is our extreme hypersexualization a rebellion, you know, with our government's agenda, and how what you were talking about, the abstinence-only programs in schools, and just the education young people are getting today, and the lack of information they're getting. And in light of that, there's a new campaign that Trojan Condoms has just put out, and I'm just curious if anyone on the panel has seen that, the Alexa line, which is a line for women, and it comes from the women's perspective. And if you have seen that, I'd be curious to see what you think of that. Is that
are those female condoms, or are they male?
No, they're male condoms marketed towards women under this guise of like a Club Alexa, it's called.
Oh, I've seen them. Okay,
yeah.
So I don't know what they were selling.
I was just curious.
That says it all. That really says it all.
It's very. It's
not reaching men.
Exactly.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is, the commercial doesn't necessarily let you know what it is. It a vaginal condom? It leaves you questioning. But I was just interested in that as how they're marketing it towards women, and is it effective, and is it do women find that offensive, or are they excited about it?
I'm interested to know what you all think about what we can learn, if anything, from how other cultures have dealt with pornography, specifically cultures in Europe like France or Denmark that are at face value, much less prude than America and have had, at least before the internet, porn was much more present in those countries than in America, and yet they seem to have much healthier gender roles than Americans, broadly speaking. And my read on it is that, you know, in these countries, there's much more of a cultural identity to counterbalance the messages that porn sends. And one of the main ways in which pornography kind of infiltrates America in negative ways is that we don't have more discussions like this on public television or something. So I know you can't create a culture that will, you know, give the alternative in terms of gender roles that porn creates, but how do you think we can facilitate something more along the European model?
Okay, so
and just on a tangent, another thing. I'm shocked that we haven't discussed AIDS a bit more. I don't know.
Okay, so that's good. So the questions are racist stereotypes, violent stereotypes, and pornography, cultural stereotypes. Second, what do we think of Alexa Trojan condoms for women? Do we find it offensive? Do people find it offensive? And third, how have other cultures dealt with pornography, perhaps the European model more successfully, and AIDS?
Well, I mean,
there you go.
I mean, porn is without a doubt the most racist, consistent media expression in the United States. There's no doubt about it. You go on a website, it's the sultry Asian girl, the big dick black guy, these hot Spanish, spicy Latina. They use every conceivable stereotype to sell it. And to me, that is more dangerous than the sex itself.
I think that, you know, to go back to the very first question, also touch on some of these questions, I don't think that this is a reaction to the political climate. I think that it is big business. The goal here is profits, and I think that, if anything, it's more a reflection of the technological advances, and I think the profits that are to be made, and I think, but I would say that there is a cultural message that's very supportive of pornography, and that what I would say needs to be done, rather than legislating the issue, is to have more information, and, as Kay said, to really put it into context. You know, we have, speaking of education in high schools, many high schools in this country have begun media education programs because kids are so targeted by advertising, by marketing, by media messages. They don't know the difference between the O'Reilly factor and a straightforward news report. They don't know the difference between something that's targeting to sell them something versus something that's intended to inform them. And I think that similarly with sex education, kids need to have some kind of understanding that this pornography is a product. It is created by people to make money. This is how it works. These people are paid. And these images do not necessarily reflect the reality of human sexuality.
Ariel, can I ask you to respond to the Trojan question? Or you can add on that.
Question I can't help. I want to piggyback on what Pamela said, because while I agree that this is about business and it isn't caused by, you know, this administration or this political climate, I think it's a pretty good fit for this political climate. Because if you're in an incredibly restrictive environment, why wouldn't you turn back to these extremely old school, very retrograde ideas about gender and sexuality? It challenges nothing.
There's no doubt that the cultural of the Bush-Reagan years has repressed, has tried to shut down, has tried to restrict our access, what we see, what we hear, and there's no doubt in my mind that the culture is rebelling on every level against that.
So you think that it's a rebellion? In other words, we wouldn't have porn.
No, I'm not saying that.
If we didn't.
No, we had porn before Reagan.
Right.
Good. But I'm
Okay.
saying that the permutation of it into the mainstream culture is linked to a kind of fuck you. Back the other way.
People are rebelling against.
I can tell you exactly. I'll take it from a hip hop point of view. There's no doubt that the lyrics and the imagery, and so much of it is driven by a sense of, I'm going to make my statement against that over and over again. And I think that, and because hip hop
What about in the 90s?
I'm saying in 90s through. I mean, sure.
Yeah, but that's there wasn't.
Yeah, but I mean, Clinton, let's not go into Bill, but Bill wasn't that progressive. Let's not even get into Bill.
He did his fair bit to promote pornography.
What I'm saying to you is that there's a culture of dissatisfaction that has been going on for a long time, that hip hop is part of, and because hip hop speaks directly to young males, it drives and informs a lot of their attitudes toward the mainstream.
I want to say something about the international question and the violence question. They tie together because you can't even show correlation between exposure and availability of even violent pornography and either violence against women or discrimination against women. Some of the cultures that have the lowest gender equality and the highest rates of violence against women, pornography is completely censored and unavailable, along with other human rights. For example, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then the question was asked about certain European cultures like Sweden and Denmark and Germany, where the rates of gender equality are very high and violence very low, and there are no restrictions at all on pornography. In terms of the racial stereotypes, I just want to use one example from my book to illustrate that no two women can possibly agree on whether something is empowering or whether something is the opposite. One of the examples I use is a cover from a lesbian magazine on our backs of an Asian American woman, Dawn Wan, who was her idea. It was a 1993 cover, and she's standing in a very strong posture, and she thought that this showed, it countered the stereotypes of Asian women as being very passive, and that it showed that she was very strong and in control. And then there were some other lesbian feminists who thought that this was terribly degrading and debasing, and they attacked feminist lesbian bookstores that were selling the magazine and ripped the covers off it. So I think, what some people might see as a negative racist stereotype is not seen that way by other people.
Can you show that picture, actually, since you have it in front of you? It's this one, right?
Yeah.
But the same way that you talk about that it's very difficult to prove causation between pornography and violence, which I agree. I think similarly, it's very difficult to say that causation between the way a society depicts gender and the way in which gender functions in that society and pornography. I think it's apples to oranges, and there's so many variables in terms of their politics, in terms of the way feminism is operated in those particular countries, that I think you can't really compare and say, well, but in Sweden they have pornography, it's legal, and they don't have as much of a problem with sexual violence. I think that, again, there's just too many variables there.
I agree with that, but it shows that you cannot prove that there is. So
absolutely, and I agree.
Let me invite the next three people to come up. And I want to just point out, I think it's really interesting that no one chose to address the AIDS question. And I wonder if that reflects a class, a class.
No, let's say this about it. I wanted to talk about this earlier, anal sex. And that one of the major changes in pornography.
Nelson, you're really doing your part to expand our
is there's whole lines of videos, just anal this, anal that. There's lines and lines. And now if you watch porn, the cum shot is not necessarily the big moment. It's the anal sex section of it. And it's crazy because I think that is affecting. I think guys are seeing this stuff and asking their girlfriends for it. And in porn, it may seem fun, though the girls who are doing it don't seem that happy.
And you're making a connection with AIDS.
I just think that, in general, about a year ago, was a black male porn star came down with the virus. I think his name was Mike James or something, and that sent a shock through the business. And I think that was a very big way. I mean, the industry really worked very hard to shut down much talk about that. But obviously, you're promoting potentially unhealthy sexual practices in everything you sell.
One interesting thing is that in New York Magazine this week, there was a whole package on sex, and there was a poll in which they asked New York high schoolers what they did, and then they asked parents of New York high schoolers what they think their kids did, and 12% said that they did that they performed anal sex, and 1% of the parents thought their kids did this. That's a higher percentage than the overall national average, according to earlier studies. So you do have to wonder if there is some kind of influence of pornography.
There are other surveys that support that idea.
Let me invite the next person to ask the next three, and you're next.
I feel like a little bit of the panel has kind of fallen onto the old practice of having women as victims in porn, either in front of the camera or in the bedroom, apparently. But what about women as agents in pornography, not only in front of the camera, but also creating porn, maybe more sex-positive, women-focused, as opposed to the so-called women-focused porn? What about women as agents there? And also, I feel like it's been acknowledged that culture and pornography, it's kind of gone back and forth, the chicken and the egg thing. But I feel like more times than not, it's the effect, like the lack of comprehensive sex education that has children looking to porn to how to have sex, as opposed to like porn, like children just going to porn, or maybe the lack of communication, or the Madonna whore dichotomy, having men look at pornography and that being the cause of divorce and lack of communication instead of like pornography being the cause of that. Like, I feel we can discuss that a little more.
Okay.
I just have a question. You know, I feel that most people who like have any correlation to the mainstream could care less where what's shoved and when, but we do care about being bombarded by it. We do care about our children being bombarded by it. We do care about the accessibility of it to them. And the people who wouldn't normally, let's say, even take it up, you know, if you're just sitting there clicking around your screen and here's a pop-up and here's a pop-up and here's a pop-up, and what are you going to do? Because already you got anal, you got like three-way, you got this, you got horses, and all you're trying to do is like figure out, you know, what encyclopedia means. You know what I mean? So there's got to be some kind of regulation to this. This is ridiculous. And then, you know, you look around and people, nobody's in love, nobody you know, nobody knows what love is anymore. Everybody's like, well, let's go, you know, shove this up your ass, we're in love, let's get married. Have a few kids, get divorced, all right, we're good. You address it.
I'm curious about whether you guys, or you panelists, think that porn is ageist, and how so. There was an episode on Sunday night of Desperate Housewives in which a middle-aged couple on the show, it was revealed that they have a penchant for making and viewing their own porn tapes. And this was immediately written off. It wasn't like really taboo because Desperate Housewives tries to be kind of edgy, I think, a little bit. But it was immediately just assumed, you know, that's weird. We're not going to let, one of the other couples wouldn't let their children play together anymore. So I'm just wondering whether, I mean, just in this example, maybe if it were a younger couple, would it be acceptable that this, you know, that a married couple creates and watches their own porn? That's very specific, but I guess I'm just wondering what age group might porn harm the most, because it seems that, I mean, I'm not a user, I don't really know very much about the porn industry, but it seems like younger, let's say women or just younger people are often the subjects of porn videos and porn media. So I'm just curious whether maybe older people in general are actually harmed more, or kind of maybe are more offended. I don't know.
Okay, so we have the questions. What about more pro-sex, women-made pornography, since we've focused on sort of the other angle of that? And then the second question about being bombarded by pornography, and I guess what to do about that. And the third is porn ageist. I think that's really interesting because we've really been talking about its impact on children and how bad it is for children, and in a way it's cruelest to older people who as she mentioned, it's very ageist. Anyone care to respond to these?
I can talk about the last one, which is, it's interesting. I don't know if I don't actually think that porn is ageist. The pornography itself, there's old people's porn. You can go and find that on the internet. On the other side of the spectrum, I think what is really alarming is that most men who look at porn will say, the thing that I find truly offensive is child pornography. And yet, almost everyone I interviewed had come into contact with child pornography online, often not deliberately. There are many ways to slip into it, and it is a slippery slope, even though we tend to think it's very defined. Because child pornography, technically, is anyone depicting anyone under the age of 18. And so when you have pornography that depicts, you know, women over 18 as, you know, schoolgirls, as, you know, prom queens, you're looking at images of women as young people. And that's one way in which people slip in, because the guys say, well, I actually want them to really look that innocent. I want them to really be that pure. Another way is that men often become interested in voyeuristic websites, and so they'll be looking at nudist beaches, for example, and they'll be looking at families, and then, oh, there'll be a young woman there, and there's no sign there that says, oh, she's 18 and over. Often it's very clear that she's not, and so she may be already, you know, past, you know, have gone through puberty, so she may be 14 or 15. That's still technically child pornography, and then often they'll slip even younger and say, oh, what does it look like, you know, when a girl is just developing? And so I think that in that sense there isn't an age barrier, but also on the consumer end, there isn't a difference in terms of the amount of harm, or I would say it's the kind of harm is very different. When children look at pornography, they're learning to sexually cue. This is when, during adolescence, boys are learning what's sexy, what's exciting, and often it's what they're exposed to, and they're masturbating to it, and you sort of have this very potent chemical cocktail, and this is what they learn is exciting. But on the other end, I talked to many people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, some who were addicted to pornography or felt themselves addicted or compulsive about it, which is its own category, but many who were in relationships and said, I just found out that my husband, we've been married for 20 years, has been looking at porn online late at night when he's told me he's catching up with work. How am I supposed to feel that he's masturbating to 20-year-old women? I'm not getting any. He's not having sex with me, and how am I supposed to compete with that? And that's just the reality of how pornography, I think, operates for people of different ages.
Does anyone else want to? Ariel, do you want to speak to the question about more pro-woman porn?
I think the thing I would just point out about that is, the women who are making pornography, they're a fairly rare breed still. They're out there, but it's not the vast majority. And when you talk about women, having agency, the vast majority of women who go into the sex industry do so because they're poor, and the vast majority of those women stay poor. So I just think that we should keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I would just want to pose the question, why do we care that there's a pornography where women, are agents? Do we really think that this is going to be a better world because there's pornography with women as agents? Absolutely. Really? Why? Why? How does it improve life? But freedom isn't everything. Yes, but that doesn't tell you there are rights, and then you can talk about a right, but that isn't the same as a good. Okay?
I'd like to invite the next and the last people to step up, and I'd just like to. We're going to take one more question. Sorry, just the last one.
Okay.
Two more? We have time for two? One or two? Okay, I'm going to ask you to keep your questions very quick.
I'm sorry. Well, I don't know if you covered this topic. I'll ask the question and give a little bit of background.
No background.
No background. Okay. How does the pornography and the image of women influence judges in divorce cases? Because it has become very horrendous in some of the counties in New Jersey, and the children are being affected as a result of that, and it's very serious.
Next question.
This is a comment. I'm Judith Levine. I've been talking about this for about 50 years. We could have been having this conversation in 1920 or in 1860 or during the French Revolution, and we could be talking about gambling or the demon rum or blasphemous pamphlets or comic books or rock and roll or penny novels or the daily newspaper. And all of these were corrupting children, and they were breaking up families, and they were ending civilization as we knew it. And it's always amazing to me that all of these corrupted children managed to grow up and sit in this room and have this incredibly literal reaction to pictures that are caricatures out of which we make fantasies of license and freedom and craziness and disinhibition and madness. That's what pornography is about. It's not about copying and getting bad and then, growing up. It's just, I'm pleased to see that we have all survived the terrible, corrupting cultures in which we have grown up for the last several centuries. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a little bit different point of view because I live in the United States for 12 years and look on these problems from different point of view. And what I could tell that from my point of view, the prime biological male function is marking the territory. It means fucking and moving everything, fucking and fighting everything that moving. And if we, and right now in modern society, we already cannot fight and fuck everything because of obvious reasons. So we substitute it for computer games, for example, violent movies or porno. And my question is, if we just remove this substitute from our culture, don't you think that it will be much, much higher rate on our streets with raping and killing? I think that's just my question.
Okay, so the questions are about judges and pornography in divorce cases. The fact that we could have been having this conversation at any time in history about anything, and yet we've all managed to survive and talk about it. And that, can somebody, that male culture is about fighting and fucking everything, and wouldn't we be much better off if that were not so?
What's the solution? I think one of the major problems is that we tend
Maybe
to
Maureen Dowd should answer that one.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, I was making
Sorry.
sure.
I think that part of the problem is that we do tend to lump pornography together with other liberal or progressive causes, or we tend to look at it and say, oh, but they said the same thing about this problem and that problem, the other one. And I think that, unfortunately, that tends to deflect attention from the question at hand, which is pornography and what the effects are and what the reality is. So I'm just going to stick to that, and I'll just say one quick thing to answer the first person's question, which is in terms of divorce cases, the the lawyers that I spoke with, the matrimonial lawyers, said that oftentimes it's the joint custody is not granted in those cases where the husband is found looking at pornography online on the family computer, and that custody tends to go to the mother only in that cases. So it has a terrible impact on fathers who are involved in those kinds of divorce cases.
Would anyone else like to speak to?
I mean, her comment, the comment about it goes back to my language point earlier. I respect everyone's saying about pornography and its nefarious impact, and I do think there is some nefarious impact out there. At the same time, if you look at the history of America, we're a country that loves fear. Fear is how we sell everything. And fear of sexuality is one of the prime drives in this culture from the very founding of how we've separated people, how we've demonized people, and how we've segregated people. And to act like that's not true is a lie. So pornography, whatever it is, it's not going to destroy America any more than rock and roll did or demon rum.
Can I just, let me just say one thing. There has never been a society that hasn't tried to regulate, and I don't mean legally, but regulate sexualities. It just doesn't exist. And that there is always some attempt to explain sex in a way that is socially valuable. That's just the nature of social organisms. So I think that this assumption that we're just those of us who are concerned about a pornified culture are somehow these flat earthers or people who are thinking about or imagining the end of the earth. I don't hear anybody talking that way, but we are talking about a culture that is being coarsened, and this, it deserves discussion, right? It's not enough to say, oh, well, we've survived. Well, yeah, we survived, but that's not enough.
Rebecca, I want to just say thank you all for coming, and thanks to the panelists. And this is.
It's early. I thought it was going till 8:30. This is not a conversation to be squeezed into an hour and a half, clearly, but I think we covered a lot of